There's a prominent entity you've likely encountered but perhaps don't fully grasp. This organization oversees an astounding $10 trillion in investments, a sum exceeding the gross domestic product of every nation on earth, with the sole exceptions of the United States and China. It holds the position of principal shareholder in a host of leading corporations including Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Tesla, ExxonMobil, JP Morgan Chase, and Pfizer, alongside 496 other companies listed within the S&P 500 index. Furthermore, its sophisticated software infrastructure manages a staggering $21 trillion in total assets across the entire global financial landscape. Notably, in the year 2020, this very firm was engaged by the Federal Reserve to procure assets during the COVID-19 pandemic, effectively positioning it as both a participant and an arbiter within financial markets. This entity is BlackRock. Should you possess stocks or a retirement savings plan, such as a 401k, it is BlackRock that exercises your voting rights, not you. You might believe you own stocks, but in reality, you possess a claim to them. BlackRock owns the actual stock and wields the power in corporate elections, approves mergers, and shapes policy throughout the American economy. You possess nothing. BlackRock possesses everything. This is not a matter of speculative theory, but rather a fundamental aspect of market structure. In 1988, BlackRock was non-existent. Today it stands as the most influential financial institution in recorded history, surpassing the might of any bank or preceding monopoly. Its power stems not merely from controlling capital, but from controlling ownership, and ownership intrinsically represents power. Let me illustrate precisely how BlackRock exerts control over markets through 5 distinct mechanisms, differentiating it from and rendering it more formidable than historical giants like Standard Oil or JP Morgan's Trust. I will also explain why this concentration of power within a singular institution signals the end of capitalism as we have historically understood it. When one company holds substantial stakes in every major corporation, when a single artificial intelligence system governs risk for the entire financial ecosystem, and when one chief executive officer commands greater influence than any elected official, we are no longer operating within a free market. Instead, we inhabit a financial oligarchy, with BlackRock as its leading oligarch. Before I delve into the intricacies of BlackRock's market control, it is essential to comprehend what BlackRock fundamentally is. Most individuals erroneously perceive it as a bank. It is not. Banks are characterized by accepting deposits and issuing loans, functions that BlackRock does not perform. BlackRock operates as an asset manager entrusted with investing capital on behalf of diverse clients, including pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, university endowments, and individual investors via exchange-traded funds. These entities entrust their financial resources to BlackRock for investment purposes. BlackRock levies a fee, typically ranging from 0.03% to 2% depending on the specific product, and then invest these funds in accordance with each client's predetermined strategy. To contextualize its immense scale, BlackRock managed $10 trillion as of the year 2024, a substantial increase from $4.3 trillion in 2013, effectively doubling its assets under management in just over a decade. To grasp the magnitude of $10 trillion, consider that this figure surpasses the total value of all U.S. currency currently in circulation, encompassing both physical and digital forms. It is also greater than the combined gross domestic product of Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom. This represents 40% of the total U.S. GDP. In essence, a single company is managing assets equivalent to 40% of America's entire economic output. BlackRock is not an isolated entity in this domain. Vanguard manages $8 trillion and State Street manages $4 trillion. Collectively, these 3 firms oversee $22 trillion, approximating 90% of the U.S. GDP. However, BlackRock stands as the largest, most powerful, and most influential among them. Crucially, unlike Vanguard, which is technically owned by its fund holders, BlackRock is a publicly traded corporation with shareholders, a CEO, and profit-driven objectives. This distinction is significant because BlackRock is compelled to make decisions aimed at maximizing its own profitability, which may not always align with the best interests of its clients. BlackRock was established in 1988 by Larry Fink and 7 partners. Fink, formerly a bond trader at First Boston, suffered a significant setback due to an ill-advised investment in mortgage-backed securities, resulting in a loss of $100 million for the firm. Although he was dismissed, this experience imparted a critical lesson: risk management is paramount. The ability to assess risk more effectively than competitors provides a distinct advantage. Consequently, Fink and his partners developed a sophisticated risk management system, which they named Aladdin, an acronym for Asset, Liability, Debt, and Derivative Investment Network. This system would ultimately become BlackRock's proprietary advantage. Initially, BlackRock focused on managing assets for institutional clients. However, in 2009, BlackRock acquired Barclays Global Investors for $13.5 billion. This strategic acquisition brought iShares, the world's largest exchange-traded fund platform, under BlackRock's umbrella. Suddenly, BlackRock's clientele expanded beyond institutions to encompass millions of individual retail investors through index funds and ETFs. This shift profoundly altered the landscape, as retail investors typically prioritize returns over engagement with proxy voting or corporate governance matters. BlackRock, by managing their investments, consequently controlled the voting rights associated with their shares. This granted BlackRock immense voting power across the entire economic spectrum. Presently, BlackRock offers over 1,300 investment products. Its most renowned offering is the iShares S&P 500 ETF, identified by the ticker symbol IVV. If you hold this ETF, you possess a fractional ownership in 500 companies. However, you do not exercise voting rights for these shares. BlackRock does. With an impressive $400 billion invested in IVV alone, BlackRock commands millions of votes within every S&P 500 company. When this aggregate voting power is considered across all of BlackRock's funds, its influence becomes abundantly clear. BlackRock casts votes on behalf of investors who are entirely unaware of its proxy activity. To elucidate the unique nature and amplified threat posed by BlackRock, let us compare it to 3 historical monopolies. First, Standard Oil, which operated from 1870 to 1911. John D. Rockefeller meticulously built Standard Oil into America's inaugural colossal monopoly. At its zenith in 1904, Standard Oil controlled 91% of oil refining and 85% of final sales within the United States, representing a horizontal and vertical monopoly. Rockefeller owned the refineries, pipelines, distribution networks, and retail outlets, every facet of the industry. This unparalleled control enabled Standard Oil to dictate prices, stifle competition, and maximize profits. In 1911, the Supreme Court declared Standard Oil an illegal monopoly and ordered its dissolution into 34 separate companies. The crucial distinction here lies in the scope. Standard Oil dominated a single industry, oil. BlackRock, conversely, controls ownership across all industries. Standard Oil could manipulate the price of kerosene, whereas BlackRock influences corporate policy at virtually every major American enterprise. Standard Oil's monopoly was overt and ultimately dismantled. BlackRock's monopoly, however, is clandestine, masked as diversified investment. There exists no legislation prohibiting a single company from holding a 7% stake in every company. This is its ingenious structure. It is a legal monopoly by virtue of being termed asset management. Second, J.P. Morgan's Trust, which operated from the 1890s to 1912. J.P. Morgan did not merely operate a bank. He commanded an expansive network of corporations through interlocking directorates. Morgan's partners occupied board seats in prominent companies such as U.S. Steel, General Electric, and AT&T, among hundreds of others. Morgan exerted control over railroads, shipping, steel, and banking. In 1912, the Peugeot Committee's investigation revealed that Morgan and 2 other banks collectively controlled corporations valued at $22 billion, equivalent to the entire U.S. money supply at that time. Morgan's influence permeated every major industry. However, Morgan's control was personal and direct. He sat on boards, appointed executives, and dictated strategy. His power was evident, rendering it politically vulnerable. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1913 explicitly prohibited interlocking directorates, leading to the breakup of Morgan's empire. BlackRock has learned from this historical precedent. BlackRock does not place Larry Fink on corporate boards. It has no need to. It owns the stock and votes the proxies. This indirect yet more absolute power circumvents legal restrictions. While interlocking directorates can be outlawed, asset managers voting client shares cannot be banned, as this is their designated function. The outcome, control, remains the same, but the legal framework is impregnable. Third, IG Farben, a German chemical cartel that existed from 1925 to 1945, representing the ultimate monopoly. By 1930, IG Farben controlled 90% of Germany's chemical production. It manufactured synthetic oil and rubber, and during World War II, it produced Zyklon B gas, used in Nazi concentration camps. IG Farben wielded such immense power that it contributed to funding Hitler's ascent to power. Post-war, the Allied forces dismantled IG Farben, splitting it into BASF, Bayer, and Höchst. The salient lesson here is that monopolies not only dominate markets, but also engage in political action, shaping policy to serve their self-interests, even facilitating atrocities. BlackRock is replicating this pattern on a global and legal scale. BlackRock does not produce chemicals, it owns the companies that produce everything. Furthermore, BlackRock exerts substantial political influence. Larry Fink advises presidents, and BlackRock alumni frequently occupy positions within the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, and the White House. However, because BlackRock operates as an asset manager rather than a producer, its monopoly remains concealed. It is not manufacturing chemicals or refining oil, but merely casting votes on shares. How significant can this be? Exceedingly so, as I will demonstrate. Now let me delineate the 5 mechanisms through which BlackRock exerts control over markets. These are not elements of conspiracy theories, but rather features of its business model that are documented, public, and extraordinarily potent. Mechanism 1. Concentrated ownership across all industries. BlackRock is either the largest or second largest shareholder in 495 of the S&P 500 companies. To provide specific examples with precise percentages as of the year 2024. In the technology sector, BlackRock owns 6.8% of Apple, valued at approximately $200 billion, making it the largest institutional shareholder. For Microsoft, BlackRock holds 7.1%, worth about $210 billion, again the largest institutional shareholder. In Amazon, BlackRock possesses 6.2%, valued at roughly $10 billion. For Tesla, BlackRock's stake is 5.6%, approximately $45 billion. Regarding Google, Alphabet, BlackRock owns 6.4%, with a value around $120 billion. In Meta, Facebook, BlackRock holds 7.5%, estimated at $85 billion. For Nvidia, BlackRock's ownership stands at 6.9%, approximately $90 billion. Shifting to other sectors, in banking, BlackRock owns 6.8% of JP Morgan Chase, 7.3% of Bank of America, 6.9% of Wells Fargo, 6.5% of Citigroup, 7.1% of Morgan Stanley, and 6.2% of Goldman Sachs. In the energy sector, BlackRock holds 7.2% of ExxonMobil, 7.1% of Chevron, 6.8% of ConocoPhillips, and 6.3% of Occidental Petroleum. In pharmaceuticals, BlackRock possesses 8.1% of Pfizer, 7.4% of Johnson & Johnson, 7.9% of Merck, 7.2% of AbbVie, and 7.8% of Bristol-Myers Squibb. Within consumer goods, BlackRock owns 6.7% of Procter & Gamble, 7.3% of Coca-Cola, 7.1% of PepsiCo, 6.5% of Walmart, and 6.9% of Home Depot. Do you perceive the pattern? BlackRock holds between 6 and 8% of every major company in America, not just one company, but every major company. This establishes a monopoly of ownership. Unlike Standard Oil, which controlled 91% of a single industry, BlackRock controls 7% of every industry. This represents a greater concentration of power. When a company holds stakes in all competitors, it is indifferent to which company prevails, as its own interests are served regardless. This is why it is significant. Imagine BlackRock owning 7% of Apple and 7% of Microsoft. These companies compete in computing, mobile devices, and cloud services. If Apple gains market share, BlackRock's Apple holdings increase in value. If Microsoft gains market share, BlackRock's Microsoft holdings appreciate. BlackRock is unaffected by which company triumphs. It owns both. This effectively eliminates competitive pressure. Now extend this logic across the entire economy. BlackRock holds stakes in Delta, United, and American Airlines. It has no vested interest in which airline dominates. Consequently, does BlackRock incentivize airlines to compete on price, service, or efficiency, or does it tacitly encourage them to maintain high prices and maximize profits, thereby benefiting BlackRock's stakes across the entire sector? The incentive is clear: suppress competition and maximize industry-wide profits. This phenomenon is known as common ownership theory, and economists have documented its tendency to reduce competition. A study conducted in 2017 by Jose Azevedo, Martin Schmaltz, and Isabel Tecu concluded that airline ticket prices are between 3 and 7% higher due to common ownership by BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Airlines exhibit less aggressive competition because their principal shareholders possess stakes in all competing entities, thereby benefiting from reduced competition while consumers face inflated prices. This constitutes a proxy for monopoly. BlackRock does not need to own 91% of a single airline. It owns 7% of all airlines and uses its voting power to maintain elevated prices across the industry. The same pattern is observable in the banking sector. Studies indicate that banks with common ownership offer lower interest rates on deposits and charge higher interest rates on loans. Why engage in competition for depositors when your shareholders own all the competing banks? The outcome is the transfer of billions of dollars from consumers to shareholders. In the pharmaceutical industry, common ownership correlates with elevated drug prices. In technology, it is associated with diminished innovation. Across all sectors, common ownership by BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street serves to suppress competition and inflate prices. This is the first mechanism of control, not outright ownership of a single company, but the acquisition of substantial stakes in all companies and the subsequent utilization of that ownership to influence industry-wide behavior. Mechanism 2: proxy voting power and corporate governance control. When you own stock through a mutual fund or an exchange-traded fund, you technically own the stock, but you do not exercise voting rights. The fund manager votes on your behalf. This is standard practice, but the sheer scale at which BlackRock operates makes it unprecedented. BlackRock exercises proxy voting rights for $10 trillion in assets, encompassing millions of individual shareholdings across thousands of companies. In 2023, BlackRock cast votes at over 16,000 shareholder meetings globally. These votes pertain to executive compensation, board elections, mergers, corporate strategy, and environmental and social policies. BlackRock voted your shares, and unless you explicitly provided BlackRock with contrary instructions, a rare occurrence for most retail investors, BlackRock voted according to the directives of Larry Fink and BlackRock's stewardship team. Here is how this functions in practice. Every publicly traded company convenes an annual shareholder meeting where shareholders vote on board members, executive remuneration, and significant corporate decisions. Voting power is directly proportional to the number of shares owned. If BlackRock owns 7% of Apple, it commands 7% of the votes. While this may not seem substantial, in companies with widely dispersed ownership, 7% often constitutes the largest single voting bloc. The majority of individual shareholders do not vote, often unaware of meeting dates. Retail ownership comprises approximately 30% of the market, yet retail voting participation is less than 30% of that figure. Consequently, institutional investors effectively determine outcomes, and BlackRock is the paramount institutional player. Consider a concrete example. In 2021, ExxonMobil faced a proxy contest. An activist hedge fund, Engine No, one which held only 0.02% of Exxon's shares, nominated 3 directors to Exxon's board with the aim of steering the company towards renewable energy. Exxon's management opposed this initiative, expending millions of dollars to combat it. The outcome hinged on the votes of large institutional shareholders. BlackRock sided with Engine No. 1, as did Vanguard and State Street. The activists ultimately prevailed, and 3 new directors were elected against management's wishes. This incident vividly illustrates BlackRock's influence. ExxonMobil is one of the world's largest companies, with a market capitalization of $400 billion. Its management was defeated by a hedge fund owning a mere 0.02% stake, precisely because BlackRock cast its votes in favor of the hedge fund. BlackRock's 7% stake proved decisive. This represents control over corporate governance. BlackRock does not manage ExxonMobil on a day-to-day basis, but it dictates who sits on the board, and the board, in turn, determines corporate strategy, CEO selection, compensation, and all other critical decisions. BlackRock asserts that it votes in the best interests of its clients. However, who are these clients? They are millions of retail investors and index funds who are unaware that BlackRock is voting on their behalf, and pension funds that have granted BlackRock discretionary voting authority. Each client may possess distinct interests. How does BlackRock reconcile these divergent interests? It does not. BlackRock votes in accordance with its own proxy voting guidelines, which are established by Larry Fink and his team. Larry Fink holds very specific viewpoints. He is a staunch advocate of environmental, social, and governance (ESG) criteria. Each year, Fink issues a letter to the chief executive officers of companies in which BlackRock holds a significant stake. These letters are not mere suggestions but directives, backed by BlackRock's substantial voting power. In 2020, Fink's letter emphasized climate change, stating, "Climate risk is investment risk." He urged companies to disclose climate-related risks and align their operations with the Paris Agreement. Companies that failed to comply faced BlackRock voting against their management in subsequent resolutions. In 2021, Fink's letter focused on racial equity and stakeholder capitalism, advocating for companies to consider the interests of all stakeholders, employees, communities, and the environment, not solely shareholders. In 2022 and 2023, Fink highlighted net zero commitments and diversity initiatives, urging companies to publish diversity data and set diversity targets. These represent Larry Fink's personal policy preferences. However, because BlackRock wields voting power over $10 trillion in assets, Fink's preferences translate into corporate policy across hundreds of America's largest companies, achieved without election and without democratic accountability. This is the very definition of oligarchy. Larry Fink possesses more voting power over corporate America than any individual in history, exceeding that of Rockefeller or Morgan, because Fink votes on behalf of millions of individuals who are unaware of his proxy influence. Mechanism. 3. The Aladdin system. This is BlackRock's clandestine weapon, a system that remains unknown to most people. Aladdin is a sophisticated software platform designed to manage risk within investment portfolios. It meticulously tracks every asset, liability, and derivative, calculating risk in real time. BlackRock developed Aladdin in 1988, and over more than 35 years, it has evolved into the de facto operating system for global finance. To illustrate its reach, Aladdin manages $21 trillion in assets. This figure extends beyond BlackRock's own $10 trillion, as Aladdin is licensed to numerous other institutions. Over 200 institutional clients utilize Aladdin, including major pension funds like CalPERS, insurance companies such as AIG, sovereign wealth funds, and even other asset managers. Consequently, BlackRock's software system analyzes risk across a colossal $21 trillion in assets, representing approximately 10% of the world's total financial assets. The critical implication here is that Aladdin does not merely track risk, it recommends specific actions. If Aladdin identifies an asset as risky, it suggests divestment. Conversely, if it detects an opportunity, it advises investment. Because Aladdin governs $21 trillion across hundreds of institutions, its recommendations carry significant market-moving potential. If Aladdin advises 50 pension funds to sell a particular bond simultaneously, the price of that bond will plummet. This constitutes algorithmic market control. The most alarming aspect is that Aladdin operates as a black box. BlackRock does not publicly disclose Aladdin's algorithms. It is proprietary intellectual property. However, these algorithms are fundamentally shaping investment decisions throughout the global financial system. A single system, controlled by one company, analyzing and directing $21 trillion in capital. Should Aladdin contain a flaw, its risk models prove inaccurate, or if it advises hundreds of clients to take the same action concurrently, it could trigger a systemic market collapse. This represents systemic risk concentrated within a singular software platform. The financial crisis of 2008 was partly precipitated by flawed risk models. Banks employed similar models, all of which underestimated housing market risk. When the housing market collapsed, these models failed in unison, leading to the downfall of numerous banks. Now envision a similar scenario, but instead of multiple flawed models, there is one overarching model, Aladdin, dictating $21 trillion. If Aladdin miscalculates risk, the entire financial system is jeopardized. Moreover, BlackRock profits from Aladdin irrespective of the quality of its recommendations. Aladdin generates $1 billion in annual revenue for BlackRock solely from licensing fees. Institutions pay BlackRock for access to and utilization of the system. Even if Aladdin's advice leads to financial losses for these institutions, they are still obligated to pay BlackRock. This represents the ultimate business model, receiving compensation for advice without bearing liability for its adverse consequences. However, there's a more profound concern. Aladdin grants BlackRock unparalleled insight into the entire financial ecosystem. This allows BlackRock to observe the trading activities of other financial entities and to assess market-wide risk exposures. This constitutes insider information on a vast, systemic level. BlackRock maintains that it employs strict internal protocols, often referred to as Chinese walls, to segregate data from the Aladdin system from its investment decision-making processes. Nevertheless, these safeguards are entirely internal. There is no external mechanism for verification. We are compelled to rely on trust, assuming that BlackRock refrains from exploiting the comprehensive oversight provided by Aladdin to gain an unfair advantage in market dealings. While it's possible this is indeed the case, the potential for both temptation and capability remains. Consider mechanism number 4, government contracts and the phenomenon of the revolving door. BlackRock's influence extends beyond financial markets. It wields considerable sway within governmental circles, and this relationship is mutually beneficial. Former BlackRock personnel frequently move into significant roles within the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, and the White House. Conversely, government officials often transition to positions at BlackRock upon retirement. This continuous flow of personnel ensures that BlackRock's objectives become aligned with government policy, or perhaps more accurately, that government policy is shaped to serve BlackRock's interests. To illustrate, in March of 2020, during the market turmoil caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the Federal Reserve required intervention. However, the Fed itself is prohibited from directly purchasing corporate bonds or exchange-traded funds. Consequently, the Fed engaged BlackRock to undertake these purchases on its behalf. BlackRock was contracted to procure corporate bonds and ETFs as part of the emergency COVID-19 relief programs. In exchange for this service, BlackRock levied fees and acquired assets, including its own proprietary ETFs. To be absolutely clear about the inherent conflict of interest, BlackRock was commissioned by the Fed to purchase corporate bond ETFs while simultaneously managing the largest platform for such ETFs. This meant BlackRock effectively bought its own ETFs using Federal Reserve funds, thereby inflating the value of those very ETFs and generating profits for both BlackRock and its clientele. In this scenario, BlackRock occupied the dual roles of both competitor and arbiter. It not only determined which assets the Fed would purchase, but also profited directly from those acquisitions. This situation exemplifies regulatory capture. The rationale presented was BlackRock's expertise and established infrastructure. While this is factually correct, enlisting the preeminent asset manager to acquire assets in a market where it holds a dominant position inevitably creates conflicts that would be deemed illegal in virtually any other professional context. Now let's examine the revolving door in greater detail. Brian Dees, who previously held the position of BlackRock's global head of sustainable investing, departed the firm in 2020 to assume the role of director of the National Economic Council under President Biden. This is a pivotal advisory position, placing him as the president's chief economic advisor. Dees played a key role in formulating the Biden administration's economic strategies, including policies related to climate and energy, sectors in which BlackRock has substantial investment holdings. Subsequently, in 2023, Dees left the White House and re-entered the private sector, focusing on advising on climate-related investments. Michael Pyle, formerly BlackRock's global chief investment strategist, became the chief economic advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris in 2021. Adali Admo, who served as BlackRock's chief of staff, now holds the position of Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, making him the second highest-ranking official within the Treasury Department. In this capacity, Adali Admo oversees financial sanctions, banking regulations, and international economic policy. These are not minor administrative roles. These individuals are top-tier economic policymakers who have transitioned directly from BlackRock. The flow of personnel also operates in the reverse direction. Larry Fink, a confidant to numerous presidents from both political parties, exemplifies this. BlackRock actively recruits former Treasury secretaries, Federal Reserve officials, and central bankers to serve as advisors and board members. Stanley Fischer, the former vice chair of the Federal Reserve, joined BlackRock as a senior advisor. Philip Hildebrand, the former head of the Swiss National Bank, occupies the position of BlackRock's vice chairman. This arrangement fosters a self-perpetuating cycle. Individuals who once formulated policy within government now leverage their experience at BlackRock, thereby benefiting the firm. Subsequently, BlackRock recruits more government officials, perpetuating this closed loop. The significance of this dynamic is clear. Whenever the government intervenes in financial markets, BlackRock stands to profit. Consider the COVID-19 bailouts. BlackRock was engaged to administer them. In terms of climate policy, BlackRock has positioned itself as a leader in green investing, capitalizing on mandates for renewable energy. Regarding financial regulation, BlackRock actively participates in shaping these rules, ensuring that the regulatory framework favors large asset managers while potentially disadvantaging smaller competitors. While these actions may not be explicitly illegal, they represent a sophisticated alignment of interests that constitutes a form of power consolidation in the 21st century rather than overt corruption. Let us now turn to Mechanism 5, Information Asymmetry and Data Dominance. BlackRock possesses a more extensive repository of data concerning corporations, markets, and economic trends than any other institution, with the possible exception of the National Security Agency. This wealth of information is derived from three primary sources. Firstly, the Aladdin system, which, as previously mentioned, analyzes a staggering $21 trillion in assets. Through Aladdin, BlackRock gains insights into investment flows, risk exposures, and trading patterns across the global financial system. Secondly, BlackRock's direct management of $10 trillion in assets provides it with a deep understanding of virtually every major company and market. It employs researchers and analysts who have direct access to corporate management across these entities. Thirdly, BlackRock's political connections afford it advanced knowledge of impending policy changes. This asymmetry of information translates directly into power. BlackRock can ascertain the investment intentions of other institutions before they are executed. It can identify sectors at risk before the market becomes aware of them, and it can anticipate policy shifts before they are publicly announced. While not constituting insider trading in the legal sense, this represents a systemic informational advantage which in turn translates into profit. For instance, if Aladdin data indicates that 30 pension funds intend to divest from emerging market bonds in the subsequent quarter, BlackRock can anticipate a decline in the prices of these bonds and position its investments accordingly. This is not illegal, as BlackRock is not privy to proprietary, company-specific information. Rather, it utilizes data on systemic flows. However, the outcome is identical. BlackRock profits from information unavailable to other market participants. These 5 mechanisms: concentrated ownership, proxy voting power, the Aladdin system, government contracts coupled with the revolving door, and information asymmetry, collectively bestow unprecedented market control. No historical monopoly has simultaneously wielded all 5. Standard Oil, for example, dominated production. J.P. Morgan controlled capital. IG Farben commanded an industry. BlackRock, however, exerts control over ownership, governance, risk management, policy, and information across the entirety of the economy. This represents the ultimate form of monopoly, and its influence is continuously expanding. Now, let us delve into the problematic issue of circular ownership, which paints a truly dystopian picture. BlackRock is a publicly traded entity. Therefore, the question arises, who owns BlackRock? The largest shareholder in BlackRock is Vanguard, which holds approximately 8% of its shares. The second largest shareholder is BlackRock itself through its employee stock ownership plans and treasury stock, accounting for roughly 5%. The third largest shareholder is State Street. However, the crucial revelation lies in who owns Vanguard. While Vanguard is technically owned by its fund shareholders, in practical terms, Vanguard's most significant holdings are in the same companies in which BlackRock invests. Furthermore, BlackRock is one of the largest shareholders in companies where Vanguard makes investments. To put this into concrete terms, Vanguard owns 8% of BlackRock. BlackRock owns 7% of Apple. Vanguard, in turn, owns 8% of Apple. Consequently, Vanguard and BlackRock function as each other's principal shareholders and are co-investors in virtually every major corporation. This establishes a circular ownership structure wherein the same limited group of asset managers collectively owns each other and, by extension, the broader market. State Street operates under a similar arrangement. State Street, the third largest asset manager with $4 trillion in assets under management, has BlackRock and Vanguard as its largest shareholders. Simultaneously, State Street is a significant shareholder in both BlackRock and Vanguard's investment funds. Collectively, these 3 entities, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, hold on average approximately 20% of every S&P 500 company, and critically, they own stakes in each other. This phenomenon is termed horizontal shareholding and represents the defining characteristic of 21st century monopoly. In the 20th century, a monopoly was defined by a single company dominating a specific market, such as Standard Oil's 91% control over oil refining. In the 21st century, monopoly is characterized by 3 firms collectively owning 20% of everything while also owning stakes in each other. The effect is identical. Competition is stifled, prices escalate, yet the structure remains legally permissible because no single firm possesses majority control over any given entity. Instead, they exercise coordinated minority control over an extensive range of businesses. This extends beyond mere market influence. This structure cultivates substantial political power. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street collectively exercise voting rights over 20% of shares across the entire economy. Their coordination is facilitated through proxy advisory firms like Institutional Shareholder Services, ISS, and Glass Lewis. When ISS recommends voting in favor of a particular board member or a merger, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street frequently cast their votes in unison. This represents coordinated control without explicit agreements. Now let me illuminate who benefits and who suffers from BlackRock's monopolistic position. Firstly, Larry Fink. As the chief executive officer and chairman of BlackRock, Fink's net worth exceeds $1 billion, with annual compensation ranging from $25 to $30 million. However, his most significant wealth accrues from his ownership stake in BlackRock. As BlackRock's prominence grows, so does Fink's fortune. This expansion has been exponential, mirroring the surge in passive index investing. The greater the volume of capital flowing into passive index funds, the larger BlackRock becomes. Fink has masterfully constructed an ideal business model. Assets are drawn in automatically, fees accrue, and due to the passive nature of index funds, BlackRock is not even required to identify superior performing stocks. It simply holds them all. Secondly, BlackRock's shareholders profit. Individuals who own BlackRock stock, traded under the ticker symbol BLK, have experienced considerable financial gains. BlackRock's stock price has appreciated by over 500% since 2010. Investors who purchased BlackRock shares have reaped benefits from the widespread adoption of passive investing strategies. However, here lies the irony. BlackRock's principal shareholders are Vanguard, State Street, and other asset management firms. Consequently, those profiting from BlackRock's success are, in essence, other monopolistic entities. The oligopoly benefits from its own self-perpetuation. Thirdly, institutional investors in index funds experience gains, albeit with certain caveats. If you hold an S&P 500 index fund, you have undoubtedly benefited from overall market growth. Index funds offer diversification and cost-effectiveness, which are positive attributes. However, you have inadvertently contributed to market concentration. Your investment has empowered BlackRock to cast votes on your behalf in ways that actively suppress competition and inflate prices. While your investment portfolio may have seen gains, you have suffered as a consumer. The prices you pay for airline tickets, prescription medications, and banking services are all higher due to this common ownership. You are profiting as an investor while simultaneously incurring losses as a consumer, and the net effect could well be negative. Fourthly, corporations themselves stand to benefit, which may seem counterintuitive. Chief executive officers and corporate boards generally favor BlackRock's involvement. The reason for this is BlackRock's passive investment approach. It does not actively agitate for corporate change or demand operational improvements. As long as the stock price demonstrates upward momentum, BlackRock is content. This dynamic grants management the latitude to prioritize their own compensation. BlackRock consistently votes in favor of management proposals, typically around 95% of the time, with the notable exception of environmental, social, and governance (ESG) issues, where the firm holds strong convictions. Management finds BlackRock advantageous because it represents the ultimate passive owner. Now, who bears the brunt of these disadvantages? Everyone else. Small investors are disadvantaged because they perceive themselves as actual stockholders, but this is a misconception. They possess a claim to the returns generated by the stock, while BlackRock retains ownership and voting rights. Small investors are consequently denied any voice in corporate governance, rendering them economically invested but politically disenfranchised. This situation can be characterized as neo-feudalism, where individuals possess a claim to income derived from property owned by a dominant entity, the lord in this analogy being BlackRock. Consumers suffer as common ownership leads to increased prices. When BlackRock holds stakes in all airlines, all banking institutions, and all pharmaceutical companies, these entities exhibit diminished competitive zeal, resulting in price increases of approximately 3 to 7% across affected industries, according to academic research. This translates to billions of dollars extracted from consumers and redirected to shareholders. You are compelled to pay more for virtually everything because BlackRock's ownership structure implicitly incentivizes price collusion. Small businesses face significant disadvantages as they must compete against behemoths owned by BlackRock. If you operate a small airline or a community bank, you are pitted against companies backed by BlackRock's $10 trillion in assets. This creates an unlevel playing field as these larger entities enjoy access to capital, political influence, and regulatory leverage that smaller businesses lack. Consequently, small businesses falter, entrepreneurial spirit wanes, and market concentration intensifies. This represents the demise of creative destruction. Workers also suffer as common ownership effectively suppresses wages. A study conducted in 2018 indicated that common ownership by State Street resulted in an approximate 10% reduction in wages within affected industries. The rationale is straightforward. When the same shareholders own all employers within a given labor market, those employers have less incentive to compete for workers. If you own both Walmart and Target, you have no vested interest in them engaging in bidding wars to attract employees. Instead, The objective is to maintain low labor costs across the entire sector. Workers endure diminished compensation, shareholders reap increased profits, and democratic principles suffer. BlackRock wields more influence over corporate America than the US Congress. Larry Fink's annual letters to CEOs often carry more weight than the majority of legislative enactments. Corporate policies concerning climate change, diversity initiatives, and governance are predominantly shaped by BlackRock's preferences, backed by its $10 trillion in voting power. This system lacks democratic accountability and transparency. Larry Fink is not elected to his position, and BlackRock's proxy votes are not publicly disclosed in real time. We only learn of BlackRock's voting decisions after the fact. The most influential entity shaping corporate America is accountable to no one except BlackRock's shareholders, who are predominantly other asset management firms. Capitalism itself is undermined. The fundamental tenets of capitalism, competition, creative destruction, and innovation are jeopardized when the same shareholders own all competing entities. This eliminates competition, drives up prices, decelerates innovation, and consolidates monopoly profits. What we are witnessing is not capitalism, but a different system altogether: corporate socialism for the privileged few and brutal competition for the rest, where BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street effectively own everything, leaving others to contend for meager remnants. Now let me illustrate why this trend is accelerating and its implications for the future. The migration towards passive investing is gaining momentum. In 2000, active mutual funds managed 95% of all assets, with index funds being relegated to niche products. By 2024, index funds now manage over 50% of US mutual fund assets. This trend shows no signs of abating. Each year, billions of dollars are withdrawn from actively managed funds and channeled into passive index funds. The reasons for this shift are clear. Index funds typically charge significantly lower fees, ranging from 0 to 0.03% for an S&P 500 ETF, compared to an average of 1% for an actively managed fund. Furthermore, the majority of actively managed funds fail to outperform their respective indices. Consequently, investors rationally opt for index funds. However, this seemingly rational individual choice leads to irrational systemic outcomes. As more capital flows into index funds, the assets under management for BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street swell. Their increased scale translates into greater voting power. With enhanced voting power, they can more effectively suppress competition and inflate prices. This creates a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Index funds contribute to the suppression of competition. Reduced competition, in turn, enables companies to achieve higher profit margins. These increased profits lead to a rise in stock prices, which then attracts even more capital into index funds. This cycle continues to accelerate. By 2030, analysts project that index funds could manage 70% of US equity assets. At this juncture, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street would collectively control voting majorities in the majority of large corporations, not individually, but as a cohesive bloc. The oligopoly would become absolute with no discernible endpoint to this progression. Why would anyone opt for an expensive, underperforming active fund when a low-cost index fund is readily available? The logic is undeniably compelling from an individual investor's perspective. However, at a systemic level, we are constructing a monopolistic framework that undermines the very principles of capitalism that index investing purports to represent. BlackRock is acutely aware of this dynamic. Larry Fink's annual letters have become increasingly ambitious over time. Fink is explicitly positioning BlackRock as the arbiter of corporate purpose, superseding the traditional role of shareholders. BlackRock exercises voting rights on behalf of shareholders who have effectively relinquished their voting power. This is not merely an aggressive power grab. It is a legal, structural acquisition of power facilitated by the proliferation of index investing. Here is what the future portends. As index funds continue to expand, active management will likely become a specialized niche, with only the largest active funds surviving. Smaller active funds will gradually disappear, further concentrating power. Subsequently, as BlackRock's collective voting power approaches majority thresholds, regulatory intervention is probable. However, Such regulations will likely be formulated with BlackRock's input, potentially leading to increased transparency requirements that disproportionately benefit BlackRock given its resources to comply, while imposing burdens on smaller competitors. Regulation in this context will likely serve to solidify BlackRock's dominant position. Finally, it is anticipated that BlackRock will expand its operations into new domains. BlackRock is already actively venturing into private markets, infrastructure projects, and real assets. As opportunities in public markets become saturated, BlackRock is poised to acquire private companies, infrastructure assets, and real estate. Eventually, BlackRock could conceivably control not only public stocks but also private equity holdings, toll roads, bridges, and water systems. This represents a trajectory from merely managing assets to outright owning them, from exercising voting shares to directly controlling assets. So, what course of action can be taken? How does one respond to a system where BlackRock commands such extensive ownership? Three primary options emerge. Option 1, acceptance and participation. Embrace index funds, as BlackRock's dominance makes them profitable. If one cannot contend with the prevailing forces, it is pragmatic to align with them. Purchasing IVV, BlackRock's S&P 500 ETF, allows one to benefit from BlackRock's monopoly for investment returns. This approach is morally neutral. One is not the architect of the system, but rather a navigator within it. However, it is crucial to acknowledge that such investments empower BlackRock's voting influence and contribute to market concentration. Option 2, divestment and active investment. Refrain from investing in index funds. Instead, select individual stocks or invest in actively managed funds that do not engage in common ownership practices. This approach demands more effort, requiring thorough research. It will likely entail higher fees and potentially lower returns, but it avoids contributing to BlackRock's monopolistic expansion. This is the principled stance, albeit one that incurs significant costs. Option 3, political action. Advocate for robust antitrust enforcement against common ownership practices. Support political candidates who recognize and address this issue. Lobby for regulations that mandate the pass-through of voting rights from asset managers to individual investors. This path is challenging, primarily because the issue remains largely misunderstood by the general public. However, with increased awareness, reform becomes a tangible possibility. Historically, monopolies such as Standard Oil, AT&T, and Microsoft have been dismantled through political action. BlackRock could be the next target, contingent upon a widespread understanding of its true nature. Let me conclude with this thought. BlackRock is not inherently malevolent. Larry Fink is not a villain. The employees of BlackRock are not engaged in a clandestine conspiracy to dominate the world. They are operating within a legal and, in fact, encouraged system. The fundamental problem lies with the system itself, a system where index investing, promoted as both democratic and efficient, paradoxically fosters an oligopolistic structure. It is a system where passive management concentrates active power. It is a system where owning 7% of everything is permissible, yet owning 91% of a single entity is deemed illegal. The law has not kept pace with the evolving structure, and this structure is accelerating. In 1988, BlackRock did not exist. By 2024, it manages $10 trillion. By 2034, its assets under management could reach $20 trillion. At such a scale, BlackRock will transcend its status as merely the largest asset manager to become the most significant economic force in human history, surpassing the power of any government or empire. Empires control territory and people. BlackRock controls ownership, and in the realm of capitalism, ownership is paramount. John D. Rockefeller established an oil monopoly. It took 41 years to dismantle it. J.P. Morgan built a financial monopoly. It took 20 years to break it apart. BlackRock has constructed an ownership monopoly in 36 years, and its influence continues to expand. The pertinent question is not whether BlackRock possesses immense power. That is evident. The critical inquiry is whether this power is compatible with the principles of capitalism, democracy, and individual freedom. When a single entity serves as the largest shareholder in corporations like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, ExxonMobil, JP Morgan, and Pfizer, among hundreds of other S&P 500 companies, when a single artificial intelligence system manages $21 trillion in assets, and when the annual letter from one CEO shapes corporate policy across the nation. When a single entity occupies the roles of both competitor, arbiter, and record keeper within international commerce, it ceases to be a free market system. This arrangement more accurately describes an oligarchy, and the dominant force in this oligarchy is BlackRock. Should this film have illuminated a mechanism previously unknown to you, and if you now grasp that your purported ownership of company shares is merely an illusion, with BlackRock actually holding the true reins of control, then you are presented with a decision. You can resign yourself to this reality, disengage your investments, or actively oppose it. Each course of action carries its own consequences. However, inaction ensures that BlackRock's $10 trillion will grow to $20 trillion, its 7% market share will expand to 10%, and its pervasive influence will solidify into unchallengeable dominance. BlackRock, the corporation that seemingly possesses all, the legally sanctioned monopoly, the force whose magnitude remains imperceptible until it is recognized, and once its presence is acknowledged, it cannot be disregarded. Enter the domain meticulously constructed by BlackRock. Its inhabitants number all individuals.